There is a place in southern Kazakhstan where the wind once carried the smell of salt and dust, but no water. For years, ships rested on dry ground. Their hulls were red with rust, their keels had sunk into cracked earth, and the paint had long since peeled away in the sun. Children played in the shade of vessels that would never sail again. Grass grew where the tide had once turned. The sea that had fed this land for generations had simply drawn back, mile after mile, until it was gone from sight. Where fishermen had once cast their nets, there was only sand and the pale crust of old salt shining in the light. To stand there was to stand on the floor of a vanished sea. You could walk for an hour toward the horizon and still not reach the water. The old people remembered the sound of waves, the young had never heard it. For a long while this was told as a story of loss, and only loss, a sea taken away by human hands, and a warning to all who would listen. And then, slowly, quietly, something began to change. The level of one small corner of that sea stopped falling, it steadied, and then, gently, it began to rise. The water started to return. The Aral Sea was once one of the largest inland bodies of water on Earth. It sat between Kazakhstan to the north and Uzbekistan to the south, resting in a broad basin ringed by desert and dry steppe. In the middle of the 20th century, it covered roughly 68,000 square kilometers. Two great rivers fed it. From the north came the Darya. From the south came the Darya. These rivers had carried mountain snowmelt across hundreds of miles of desert for thousands of years, keeping the sea full and alive. Each spring, the meltwater came down from distant peaks and found its way at last to the sea. The Aral was not deep, but it was generous. Its waters held large numbers of fish, and the shallows teemed with life. Towns grew along its shores, their streets sloping down toward the harbors. Fishing fleets set out each morning while the light was still grey. The canneries packed the catch and sent it by rail across the wider region. For the people who lived here, the sea was not a distant thing. It was work. It was food on the table. It was the rhythm of daily life, the smell of the wind, the tallies of the day's catch spoken over supper. Families measured the years by good seasons and lean ones. Few of them could have imagined that a sea so vast, so much a part of the horizon itself, could ever disappear. The change did not come from drought alone, it came from decisions. In the 1960s, planners in the Soviet Union set out to turn the dry lands of Central Asia into fields of cotton and rice. Cotton, in particular, was prized. They called it white gold, and they wanted a great deal of it. To grow it in a desert, they needed water, and the water they chose to take was the water of the two rivers that fed the Aral Sea. Great canals were dug across the sand, some of them hundreds of kilometers long. But much of that water never reached the crops at all. In the loose desert soil, without proper lining, it simply soaked away, seeping into the ground along the route. What did reach the fields grew the cotton, but at a terrible and hidden cost. With the rivers drawn off, less and less water reached the sea, and so the Aral began to shrink. At first the loss was slow, hard to notice from one year to the next. A little more beach in summer, a jetty standing a little higher above the water. But it did not stop, and it did not slow. By the 1980s, the shoreline had retreated so far that the fishing towns stood stranded, far from any water. The sea drew back from its own harbors. In time, it split into separate parts. What had been one body of water became a smaller sea in the north and a larger dying sea in the south. The water that remained grew saltier and saltier as it shrank, until it was far saltier than the ocean itself. The fish could not survive it. One by one, the boats stopped going out, and the nets were folded away for good. It is often called one of the worst environmental disasters of the last century, and for many years it seemed there was no way back. When a sea leaves, it does not leave clean ground behind. The exposed seabed was covered in salt, and in the residue of the pesticides and fertilizers that had washed down the rivers from the cotton fields over many years. All of it had settled to the bottom, and now the bottom lay open to the sky. When the wind rose, and on this flat land it rose often, it lifted this dust into the air and carried it for many miles. People in the surrounding towns breathed it. It settled on their fields, on their washing, on the sills of their windows. The old harbour town of Aralsk, once a busy port on the Kazakh side, found itself surrounded by dry land. The water that had made it a port had gone, and taken the town's purpose with it. The local climate changed as well. Without the great body of water to hold and release its warmth, the summers grew hotter and the winters grew colder. The gentle balance that a sea brings to the land around it was gone, and the weather turned harsh and unforgiving. Families who had fished for generations lost their living. Many packed what they could and left for other towns and other work. Those who stayed remembered how it had been, and told their children about a sea that the children had never seen and could scarcely believe. For a long while, that seemed to be the end of the story. But the northern part of the sea, the smaller part on the Kazakh side, still had one thing in its favor. It still had a river. The Sea Darya, though weakened and much reduced, still flowed toward it, carrying what water was left down from the mountains and the fields. The trouble was that much of that precious water simply drained on southward, spilling into the vast salt basin where the larger sea had died. There it evaporated in the heat and was lost, doing no good to anyone. The idea, when it came, was simple in its heart. If a barrier could be built across the narrow channel to hold the river water in the north and stop it running away to the south, then that northern sea might begin to fill again. Hold the water and let the river do the rest. There had been earlier attempts. In the 1990s, local people, unwilling to wait, built a low dam of earth by hand to try to hold the water back. And for a time it worked. The northern water rose a little, and hope rose with it. But the dam was not strong enough for the task. Storms and rising water broke it more than once, and each time the water they had gathered spilled away again into the sand. What was needed was something built to last, engineered with care, and paid for properly. In time, that support came. The government of Kazakhstan, working together with the World Bank, began the Sea Darya Control and North Aral Sea project to control the flow of the Sea Darya and to build a proper dam across the channel that joined the north to the south. The dam was called Kok-Aral. It was completed in 2005. It stretched about 13 kilometers across the channel, a long low wall of earth and stone laid down across the gap where the northern water had been escaping. Set into it was a spillway, a controlled gate to release water safely when the level rose too high behind the barrier. Its purpose was plain. It was to keep the water of the Sea Darya from draining away into the southern basin and instead to hold it and gather it in the North Aral Sea. The results came faster than many had dared to hope. Engineers had expected the sea to take several years to rise to a useful level. Instead, in just months, the water began to climb day by day, week by week. The river, no longer losing itself to the south, filled the northern basin far more quickly than the calculations had promised. The level of the North Aral rose by several meters. The surface area grew, spreading out across ground that had been dry for years. The shoreline, which had retreated so far that it lay perhaps 100 kilometers from the old port of Aralsk, began to move back toward the town, reversing a journey that had taken decades. And as the fresh river water filled the sea, something else happened, quietly and beneath the surface. The salt, which had risen so high that almost nothing could live in it, began to fall. Diluted by the incoming river, the water grew closer to what it had once been, and closer to what living things could bear. The sea was becoming a sea again. With the salt falling and the water rising, life found its way back. Fish that had vanished began to reappear. Some were carried in on the current of the river itself. Others were restocked with patient care, released into the recovering water in the hope that it would now hold them. Freshwater species that people here remembered from their younger days, carp and pike and bream among them, returned to waters that could once more support them and let them breed. The flounder, a saltwater-tolerant fish introduced back in the 1970s, had been the one commercial catch to survive through the worst of the salty years, and now it shared the sea with the fish that had come home. The catch, which had fallen almost to nothing in the worst years, began to grow again, season by season. Fishing crews mended their nets and went out onto the water once more, following routes their fathers had known. A fish processing plant reopened in the region, and the catch travelled once again to market, as it had done long ago before the sea drew back. The birds came too. Where there had been only bare salt flats, there were now shallows and reeds along the returning shore, soft green margins where the land met the water. Waterbirds found feeding grounds again. The wetlands near the mouth of the river, which had dried and shrunk almost to nothing, began to recover, offering shelter to ducks, to pelicans, and to other travellers of the great flyways that cross this land in spring and autumn. Nature did not need to be told what to do. Given water, it simply came back, in its own time and its own order. Quietly and without ceremony, the living sea reassembled itself. For the people, the change was more than numbers on a chart or lines on a map. In villages along the northern shore, the water came close enough once more that boats could be launched from the land again, without a long haul across dry ground. Some families who had left in the hard years came back, drawn home by word that the sea was returning. Younger people who had grown up hearing the old stories, who had known the sea only as a memory in other people's voices, could now walk to its edge and see it for themselves, and hear the sound of the water. The town of Aralsk, still not fully reunited with the sea, watched the water draw nearer than it had been in a generation. Reports over the years have described the distance from the town to the shore shrinking greatly, from around 100 kilometers at the worst of it, to a small fraction of that distance. The air grew a little kinder as well. With more water on the surface to hold down the seabed, the dust storms that had troubled the region for so long began to ease. The summers softened a degree. The harsh edges of the weather were worn down again by the presence of the sea. It would be wrong, though, to say that everything returned. The southern sea, on the Uzbek side, remains largely lost, and much of that great basin is now desert, dry and white with salt. The North Aral, even revived, is far smaller than the whole sea once was. But in the north, a corner of what was lost has been given back. And for the people who remembered the old days, and who had waited so long, that was no small thing. There is a lesson in this quiet place, and it is a hopeful one. We often speak of nature's losses as final, as doors that close and are never opened again. The Aral Sea was, for many years, told in exactly that way. A cautionary tale, a warning of what people can do to the land when they take more than it can give, and take it faster than it can be replaced. And much of that is true, and we should not pretend otherwise. What happened here caused real harm, to the land, to the water, and to the people who depended on both. Much of that harm cannot be undone, and the southern basin stands as a reminder of it. But the North Aral tells us something else as well, something worth carrying home. It tells us that when the water is allowed to flow, when a barrier is built with care and patience, life does not wait to be invited. The salt retreats, the fish return to the shallows, the birds return to the reeds along the shore, the boats return to the water, and the people return to the shore to meet them. A sea that was written off as gone forever is, in one small corner of the world, a sea once more, smaller than it was, but living, and that is enough to change how we think about what is truly lost. Thank you for spending this time with us here at the edge of the returning water. If you would like to walk with us through more forgotten places where nature quietly finds its way home, you are warmly welcome to subscribe.